Welcome, and thanks again for joining us for another episode of Start the Week with Wisdom. I'm your host, Bridget Burns, Executive Director of the University Innovation Alliance.
And I'm Doug Lederman, editor and co-founder of Inside Higher Ed.
Each week, I team up with a journalist, typically Doug, to have a conversation with a leader in the field to try and distill a sense of perspective about this moment. Ideally, gather some learning from their leadership and, again, to give you a little bit of dose of wisdom for the week ahead. That's why we call it Start the Week with Wisdom.
And we're joined this week by Chancellor Joe Castro from the California State University system. Chancellor Castro became Chancellor of the system formally early this year. He was appointed late last year after having spent some years as president of Cal State Fresno, and spent a bunch of years before that at the UC system. And so he's been a Californian for pretty much his whole life, I believe. So, Joe, welcome to the broadcast.
Thank you. Great to be back with you. I can't believe it was February when we were last talking.
I know, it's wild. And I was just going to say, I saw that you were the first Californian who's served in this role. Is that true?
That's true.
That's
yeah.
fantastic.
Hard to believe, but of the California State University, but that's true. Also the first sitting campus president to be chosen as chancellor. So very interesting dynamics.
Yeah, that's got to be incredibly helpful perspective, especially as you're now in a position to try and talk with those folks. And we were just talking that it's all remote. So you really need that experience to be able to, I think, understand what they're going through right now. So you did just first join us in February, and I wanted to just start by asking you how you see things have changed for you and your campuses since our last conversation, so we can get a sense of where things are.
Thank you. Well, a lot's happened since February. As you know, we had announced last December that we were going to be predominantly in person. And when I spoke with you in February, I still felt like we could pull that off, but it was certainly looking very challenging, and it has been a quite challenging period of time. But I'm really proud of our students and faculty and staff. We've been able to do that pretty successfully this fall. So, we agreed to a vaccine mandate, put that in place. We were able to get our unions on board. Most of them, we still have a few left who we're negotiating with. And we are predominantly in person. So we've navigated it pretty carefully. We have had a few cases, but we've managed it as well as possible. And so proud of our presidents. They've been so creative and resilient, and we've been following the science and doing what's right to protect our students as much as possible.
When I think it's Stanislaus that decided to stay virtual, correct?
Yes.
And that interesting challenges, the challenges of figuring out kind of how to balance. I've talked before about sort of the role of the system and trying to create sort of commonality versus independence is something that Cal State chancellors have been wrestling with for a long time and trying to figure out that balance. Does the pandemic complicate that even more, just because it complicates just about everything in our lives, or how do you see the pandemic having sort of influenced that sort of long-standing balancing act that the system engages in?
Yeah, thanks, Doug. I as a former president, I always appreciated that Chancellor Emeritus White did give us as much flexibility as possible to deal with local circumstances. And I've tried to continue that, even though we do act as a system every single day. In terms of the pandemic, in California, each county has its own public health department. So in fact, it makes it quite challenging to have any kind of a one-size-fits-all approach to the pandemic. And while our presidents and I have agreed on general guidance, in the case of Stanislaus, President Jun had consulted with her county public health department. There had been a spike. There had been relatively fewer people vaccinated, and she made the decision, and I supported her to do that. Our other 22 campuses have moved forward according to their regular schedule. And we're about 80% or so in person throughout the system.
That's super helpful. I want to shift to what you're hearing and seeing from campuses, specifically around what you're hearing from students. I think that right now we're all feeling very disconnected, and I think you sit in a unique position where you're hearing from what's going on with students at a variety of places. And so, could you just give us a sense of what you're hearing right now, and maybe anything that's different from last fall?
Yes, I've been spending a lot of time, Bridget, listening to our students as well as our faculty and staff and alumni. In terms of the students, I've been listening carefully to their experiences. And as you both know, the pandemic has been so incredibly challenging for many of our students, especially those from backgrounds, many of our students are first generation to college students, lower income students. And it's really important for me to understand exactly what they've been going through. And I'd say that the emergency grants have made an important difference for them. Our emphasis on basic needs programs, whether it's food or housing or technology, have also been important. The mental health issues have really come to the fore. I hear about that from them and our faculty and staff. And fortunately, we're able to inspire more investment from the state in this area. And I think that's going to help us to serve those needs. And then as it relates to virtual education, in general, what I hear from them is that they didn't like being, isolated. No one wants to be isolated. They didn't actually have a lot of issues with virtual education. Many of them really, embraced it, and many of them still want to have virtual education courses, but they don't want to have to be locked in their rooms. They want to be able to do it even on the campus. And in general, what I've heard from them is they want to be back on the campus. There are, of course, a handful that are concerned about that, and we've done our best to be as flexible as we can within our larger system to meet specific needs. And for those who continue to be unvaccinated, we're trying to inspire them to be vaccinated, and we're not going to allow them to be on campus much longer. We've got some dates at many campuses where in order to be on the campus and to take in-person courses, you must be vaccinated unless you have an exemption. So those are some of the things that I've been hearing about. And I think it's really important as well to think about the fact that it's been so challenging for them, and our retention rates. I expect that we're going to see some issues there. We didn't a year ago, but I'm going to be seeing some data this fall, and I'll be looking carefully to see what we can do to address any challenges that have come up.
That issue of virtual education, even when students on campus, we always had some students who did that, but I think your sense aligns with mine that we're going to see a lot more interest among students, even when they're physically on a campus, in the sort of flexibility of when and where and how they attend. And I think that has the potential to be pretty challenging for institutions, it seems to me, because I don't know if that means you have a section of every course that needs to be delivered virtually, or whether you try to have it doing sort of a version of that sort of high flex where students where instruction's being offered at the same time, both in person. But that's a potentially pretty big lift for institutions. I'm curious in your early sense of sort of how your campuses are likely to be able to meet that expectation if that's where we're headed.
Yeah, you're right, Doug. That is a big lift. We've learned a lot. We became the nation's largest online university overnight at the beginning of the pandemic. We didn't expect that to happen, of course. We invested a lot in support for our faculty, and many of them are now seeking certification to continue teaching virtual education. And those decisions are really made at the campus level between our faculty and deans and provosts. And what the presidents and I have agreed to is that we're going to be student focused. And to the extent that students are wanting more virtual education, I think we're going to be as flexible as we can. But I'll tell you that most of the mail I received throughout the earlier part of this year was from students and families saying, please, I want to be back on campus. But I know our student leaders tell me they even like taking courses and working together in cooperative spaces. So I'm hearing more about that as well. And I think we just need to be thoughtful and as flexible as we can.
That's I think that everyone is wrestling with that same issue. It's
Yes.
totally, we'll see as we sift through the lessons from the past couple of years. So I did want to shift to something that's really coming up right now, which is burnout. I'm hearing and seeing it. It's someone's posted something that said it's not that burnout isn't coming back. It's just that it never left. But we're just kind of continuing to bottom out. People got kind of a bit of a reprieve in July, but now it's really happening. And so I'm just wondering, like, how are you as a leader looking at that issue? How are you talking about it? And have you seen any new approaches to addressing it, or are you considering anything? Just because I think this is something that in the past we would higher ed could normally just kind of like, get back to work, whatever. But I don't know that that's possible right now.
Yeah, I don't think that is possible. I think we need to, people like me need to really listen to our colleagues and to those that we serve. And I know with my presidential colleagues, including myself when I was a president, I really didn't take much time during that earlier part of the pandemic. So I very much encouraged the presidents to do that, especially this summer. And I was happy that many of them did that. And the same with my colleagues here in the Chancellor's office. So I do think it's important to do that. And, I did that in August for a bit. So I'm trying to also show others that I'm walking my talk. And then, in terms of our employees at large, we have been listening to them in terms of our repopulation on campuses and in our Chancellor's office. And to the extent it's possible to have some flexibility as we bring more folks back to the office, we're going to pursue those ideas and experiment a little and see how that works. And my hope is that will help a little bit. And I think, as I said in my State of the CSU address last week, flexibility and compassion are both really important guideposts for me. And I'm trying to apply that here, and to the extent that we can invest more in counseling and support for all those that we serve, I will certainly support that as well.
Can you expand a little bit on what flexibility and compassion look like, and have you had to change actual policies to provide more of that, or is it a way of treating people, or some combination?
Yeah, we are trying some new things here in my office. For example, we're going to have some flexible schedules that allow folks that have jobs that they can do remotely, that they would do those a couple of days a week and then would be here a couple of days a week. That also has the advantage of having, lowering the density in our offices. Our campuses are trying different approaches as well. Because I don't serve students here, they have a different sort of a challenge, and we've agreed that we need to be student focused. So that's kind of the guiding light there. But to the extent it's possible to have flexibility, for those who are parents, if they have a child who suddenly has to quarantine for a period of time, then of course we should be flexible and compassionate there. Or someone who's taking care of someone. It's just sad this morning as I was walking in, my colleague, he seemed a little down, and I asked him what was wrong, and his sister died yesterday of COVID, and she was fully vaccinated, and relatively young woman. And it just shows how there's so much we don't yet understand about this pandemic. So it's really important, in my view, to be flexible, compassionate, and also to, if we have to pivot, let's pivot. And I know that can be frustrating for some people if there is change like that, but we've pivoted as a system when we've needed to, and we'll continue to do that if we have to.
Wow, that's really, yeah, that's stunning. So I'm thoughtful about the idea of flexibility and how that is not a muscle higher ed typically had, but now we need to flex it. We've learned a bit of it in the last year, but I know someone right now who's working at an institution here in Oregon, and their kids can't be vaccinated, and they're not doing mask policy at their school, so they are going to have to homeschool the kids. And the institution is not letting that person work from home while this is all happening. And it's just like, it seems that there are some institutions who believe, be back, no, we got to go back to rigidity. You had your year of that, but it just really is unrealistic. We have to be more flexible. I think flexibility is going to be king. And it's not just in this moment, it's the future of the workforce, because it's going to be what's expected if you really want to retain quality talent. And I think we have to learn it and actually integrate it into our way of being, and not just dabble with flexibility as a system.
I agree, Bridget. And, and reasonableness is another guiding principle for me. I mean, what's reasonable? I mean, to go out of your way to adhere to some old rule just because, that doesn't make any sense to me. So just applying reason to different situations that come about. And in this case, you mentioned it would be eminently reasonable to give that parent flexibility.
Yeah. I want to shift to any lessons that you have seen or taken from observing other leaders in higher ed, good or bad, from the pandemic. I can see some, I've learned a lot of lessons from governors in other states, but I'm wondering if you might have observed if there's anything that it has improved, you think, or evolved about your leadership as a result of observing how others have led in this moment.
Yeah, I think so. It builds on some of the things that we talked about last time. I do think that there is a temptation for some of us to jump to a certain conclusion quickly. And what I have found throughout the pandemic is if I don't have to jump to a conclusion quickly, I try to understand the dynamics better, try to listen to different voices before making a judgment. And we did that with our vaccine requirement, for example, listen to different voices. But I've found throughout the pandemic, those leaders who are used to being fast on the draw, so to speak, that sometimes works against them. And then also I found the lack of flexibility can be difficult in terms of making decisions. So I've tried with my presidential colleagues to practice that flexibility, to really focus on our mission and our values. What are we really trying to accomplish? And then to be more flexible in terms of the strategies and the tactics, and realizing that we may have to pivot from one week to another on a vaccine requirement or some other kind of approach that we're thinking about. So those are a couple of lessons that continue to be powerfully important for me. And I think that it's important in my opinion, for leaders of higher education institutions and other organizations to be as reflective as they can, because of the situation we're in. There is no handbook at all for leadership during this time, and we're writing it together. So those are just a couple thoughts this morning.
It's interesting you say that, because that makes all the sense in the world to me. And yet we had a lot of people talking about how sort of applauding institutions for speeding up the pace at which they made decisions during the pandemic, and suggesting that was something that colleges and universities should do more of going forward. And so I'm interested in how you, again, like everything else, important is probably a balancing act. But I'm just curious in terms of how you sort of the sense that higher ed moves too slowly is a common trope. And so I'm curious just in terms of how you're thinking about that going forward, being reflective while also being decisive. They seem like they can be in conflict, but maybe not necessarily.
Yeah, I don't think they are. I don't think they were before the pandemic, but I specifically now, the way things are changing so quickly, I do think these big decisions deserve reflection. You know, I've also seen universities that have really, stayed connected to a decision that may not be a good one just because they didn't want to switch up. And, you know, for us, one of the big decisions we made again last December is we were going to be predominantly in person, but there were some months, you know, earlier this year where we really pushed that decision. Is that still reasonable? And we decided that it was, and we decided these are the things that we need to do to make it safe. So in addition to our vaccine requirement, we've required masks in classrooms, frequent testing, and we did that based on advice from Dr. Carrie Byington, who's just been a wonderful resource for us. She's the head of health affairs for UC, and this is her field of interest. And she's supported us so well. And, you know, I've watched universities who don't want to bite the bullet on requirements or masking or testing, and now they've got cases galore. And all that could have been avoided if they had listened to, you know, scientists like Dr. Byington. And I'm thankful that we have. And, you know, even when we've had some issues, we've had strategies in place to keep our cases and any, you know, breakouts as close to zero as possible.
That's great. I want to ask you about things that we should be focusing on. We're spending a lot of energy talking about the pandemic, about virtual learning, spending a lot of energy thinking about racial equity.
Yes.
But I'm just wondering if there's something that we should be spending more time talking about as a sector that you might not be hearing as much as you'd like, given everything that's swirling.
Well, that's a great question. I do think that we, in our system, we've really got to focus even more attention on the equity gaps that have been so stubborn between our underrepresented students and other students, and our Pell Grant students and other students. So we've been pushing very hard in those directions, sharing data in new ways, coming up with some new strategies based on what we're learning across the country and what we've learned within our system, aligning our resources to those needs. Those are, for me, that would be job number one for the CSU, is to eliminate those equity gaps as we lift up our graduation rates. And the push we're making at the federal level with the double the Pell Grant movement will help, including DACA students. We serve among the most DACA students in the country. That will help too. But I would say that's number one for me and the presidents and our board of trustees. And thankfully, our governor and the legislature here have invested more in that area, and we're going to need to ask them for greater investment in these coming years. And that will really help California, because that will mean that we'll have tens of thousands each year, and eventually hundreds of thousands more graduates who are able to be leaders here in our state.
That's wonderful. I think you're right. That is what we need to be, because there's so much noise right now, and focusing on that. It's long-term work. That's not short-term work, and it requires a level of discipline. So I want to shift to rapid fire, which is I have two questions in particular for you. One is around the best advice that has served you in your career from someone else, and then also I'm going to follow up with the advice that you find yourself most consistently giving others who are interested in leadership. So what's the best advice that has served, that someone else gave you, that helped you in your career?
I've had a lot of great advice. I mean, the one that I'm thinking about today, just because it relates to other parts of our conversation, is came from Jim March, who is my doctoral advisor at Stanford, and we studied leadership together. And he said to me, it's so important for a leader to do the right thing, even if they get knocked over. And if they do get knocked over, then you stand back up and get ready and, get back on the horse, so to speak. But he really at a very earlier part of my career helped me to think about that in a way that I often reflect upon, because as we talked about earlier, there can be these other pressures to do something different for X, Y, or Z reason. But in the end, what is the right thing to do, and connected to mission and values, I've found you can't go wrong, even if you are criticized or knocked down, so to speak. But you know that you've done the right thing. So for me, that's something I've been thinking a lot about recently. And then for leaders who want to be presidents or chancellors, I just try to share with them what it's like. The wonderful part of it, the deep meaning of it, and then the challenges of it as well, because I wouldn't want someone to be confused about that. I'd want them to understand what they might be getting themselves into, and other mentors did that for me earlier. And so I try my best to be as authentic and transparent about what this kind of job is as I can with those who think they want to go into this field.
I think that's really good advice. I think about all the professional development that it really works for folks, and it is about giving them a clear sense of what really happens. The last question, and you might not have an answer for this, is really if you have a really hard day, like a big day, like say the State of the Union day, and you are going to have to do something super important, is there anything that you think is required in your morning routine, or how you prepare for the day, that for you is like essential to being your best?
Yeah. Well, given that I've been doing this for a while now, I know that it's absolutely critical that I get a great night's sleep. And I know I'm much better with, 7 hours or 8 hours than I am with 5 or less. So that's kind of the bedrock for me is really great sleep. And then I have some routines in the morning, my favorite coffee and music and reading material. And most of my exercises in the evenings after dinner with my son. So we take long walks, and that helps me kind of clear my head for bed. So those are some of the strategies that I use, just trying to relax myself before a huge day, or, coming off of a huge day. And I'm finding that there are a lot of huge days in this position. So it's kind of a marathon. And thankfully I have a very supportive spouse and my wife. It's our 30th anniversary today. Happy anniversary to Mary.
Congratulations.
Thank you. And we have this little guy, Jess, who's just keeping me on my toes, 10-year-old. So they help me a lot. And those are some of the strategies that I use, as well as staying connected to some of my closest friends from elementary school. That also helps me too.
That's fantastic and great advice for folks. I think, especially right now when, it's not like you're out on the road traveling, or you might be, but the old routines to prepare for big events, I definitely had to reinvent them for a big Zoom keynote. It's not quite the same as, going and getting the energy from the room. So
that's right.
Yeah, congratulations, 30 years. Wow. I don't know what I don't know what that is in terms of the anniversary gifts, but I hope that you have that. And also if they're, in this moment, how do you create special moments? That's a whole topic. It's celebrating in COVID. So I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day then to celebrate that.
Thank you so much, Bridget. Thank you, Doug.
It's been wonderful having you. Always great. And I just love your calm energy. I feel like I am now settled for the day. So
Thank you. It's great reconnecting.
You too. And for folks at home, we will see you next week. And thanks again for sending in the questions. And we hope that this has helped you get a little bit of perspective and again, some wisdom for the week ahead. We'll see you next week.